I would just like to welcome you all and thank you all for coming to today's webinar. My name is Haley Davis. I'm the Vice President of Alpha Phi Sigma, Criminal Justice Honor Society here at CU Denver. In 2017, we started an event series that includes panel discussions, speaker events, and other forms of dialogue on issues related to criminology, criminal justice, and the law. I would like to take a minute to thank the students, faculty, and staff in the School of Public Affairs for their support and extend a special thank you to the Dean of the School of Public Affairs, Paul Teskey, for his help, to our events coordinator, Emma Martz, and to our marketing director, Tula Wellbrook, for facilitating these events. Finally, I would like to thank the students at Alpha Phi Sigma for their role in putting together these events. This evening's panel discussion focuses on the dynamic role of the first responder. I'll be moderating the panel, and in the last 20 minutes of this evening's event, we'll be doing audience questions. So feel free to ask your questions then to our panelists using the Q&A feature here on Zoom. On our panel tonight, we have Rhonda Kelly, a retired Aurora, Colorado firefighter and the National Director of Health, Wellness, and Resilience, as well as the founder of Responder Strong. We also have Patrick Fitzgibbons, a retired police commander in Colorado, as well as a lecturer here at the School of Public Affairs. Patrick also is a podcast host of CJ Evolution. We are down one original panelist, but we are so excited to hear from these two tonight. I'll go ahead and turn it over to them to introduce themselves further, and then we'll go ahead and get into the questions, and thank you all for coming. Rhonda, we can start with you.
Oh, thanks. Thank you very much for the invite tonight and for including me. My name is Rhonda Kelly. I started in emergency response back in 1996. I was an expanded protocol EMT operating on icebreakers in the Antarctic. When I'd done that for about 4 years, I decided it was time to get an adult job. So I landed in Colorado, was pursuing prerequisites for nursing and for PA, debating between the two while volunteering as an EMT for a rural agency and working full-time as an EMT for a local ambulance company. While I was shadowing PAs and nurses in the ER, the unit I knew I wanted to work in, I continued to see firefighter paramedics come in. I realized that job looked like a lot of fun. It was team-based. It had a lot of similarities to the structure and the schedules that I'd experienced in the Antarctic. So I jumped ship yet again, became a firefighter paramedic for Aurora, which was fantastic. Served with them for 17 years. While I was on the department, I did pick up my RN license and worked part-time as an ER nurse and a psych ER at Porter Adventist here in Denver. Toward the end of my career, I had developed a big interest in the way that all of the branches, not just fire, but also law enforcement, EMS, and dispatch, knew that suicide was our leading occupational killer, but that we weren't really making any changes or making any efforts to prepare our people for that and how to protect themselves. Became very interested in mental health overall. Started to help build out Aurora's mental health program. Unfortunately, emergency response work being very reactive, we didn't get a boost to that program until after the theater shooting. And then that became one of the priorities for the chiefs and the administration. Over the next 5 years, I continued to work in that area, physical health, mental health, emotional health, started to collaborate with CU Anschutz, in particular the National Mental Health Innovation Center there, on ways that we could improve responder mental health and well-being. That's where Responder Strong grew out of. In 2016, we founded Responder Strong as an initiative that is a collaboration between emergency responders across branches and their advocates, to include educators, researchers, clinicians, and foundations, working to improve the health and welfare not only of the responders themselves, but also for their family members. It was largely a volunteer-driven organization. I left Aurora Fire in 2017 to run it full-time. We created a ton of content, some of which we might talk about later. And it became very successful. In January of 2020, I was offered the opportunity to move Responder Strong to a new home at the All Clear Foundation, also based here in Denver. All Clear has a focus on overall responder well-being rather than just the mental health focus, and is really geared towards supporting regionally and locally successful programs like Responder Strong, who lacked in particular the fundraising capacity to scale nationally. when I moved to Responder Strong there, from where I still continue to run it, I took the position of National Director of Health, Wellness, and Resilience for Global Medical Response, the largest EMS corporation in the world. So it's been an interesting year to join that company. And it's also been an interesting year to see how Responder Strong has evolved.
Sweet. Thank you so much. Patrick, we'll go ahead and move on to you.
I don't know how I'm supposed to follow that, but again, thank you for having me in the School of Public Affairs at CU. It's an honor to be here. My name is Pat Fitzgibbons. I'm a retired police officer. I have over 2 decades of experience, last of being a police commander. I retired from that position in 2019. Prior to that, I was in the military a long time ago, serving with the 82nd Airborne Division. So big shout out to all the veterans out there, if there are any listening right now and watching this. I appreciate you. I appreciate your service. Thank you for what you're doing. And thank you for your service to the country. But I had a vast career. I had a pretty great career in law enforcement. Again, did it for over 2 decades. As you probably know or could guess, law enforcement, like any first responder job, is filled with highs and lows. And I definitely experienced those throughout my career. But overall, I had a great career. And like you indicated, Haley, thank you for the shameless plug on my podcast. I have a top-ranked podcast called CJ Evolution that I love, and I've been doing it for a while. Actually, I've had Rhonda on. It was a great show, and I'm just having a great time with the show. And I also, like you mentioned, I'm a lecturer with the School of Public Affairs at CU. I've been doing that for a while now, and I love training, or not training, but teaching and instructing and mentoring and coaching the next generation of law enforcement and criminal justice professionals. So again, thank you for the invite. I'm just happy to be here.
Well, thank you both for coming. We're so excited to have you and learn more about your careers and what you both are up to now. It sounds like you're both busy. So we'll go ahead and start about some of the background of your job, what made you interested in starting the career path that you were in, and what your responsibilities were on a daily basis. Rhonda, we'll go back to you.
Oh, thanks. So my career choices, as you probably surmised, were a little bit random. I was looking for anything that looked like a lot of fun, and that's the that looks like fun is the thought that immediately preceded most of my life choices, for better or for worse in the long run. Once I joined the fire department, it really became more of a progression. About the time that I became an RN, I'd been a firefighter paramedic for about 5 years. Had gotten to the point where the honeymoon had worn off. I didn't want to be up all night. I didn't want to be on all the worst calls. I'd started to notice some changes in myself, and I definitely noticed them in the more seasoned firefighters on the department. A lot of things that were attributed as to just being a badge of honor, a sign of swagger or saltiness, but were actually signs of stress injury, poorly managed trauma and stress that were turning people into, maybe a little jaded, a little cynical, a little negative, maybe a couple divorces, some financial issues, drinking a little too much, all the things that our culture had subverted into being signs of honor were actually not things that were really serving us well, and they were things that we could prevent. When I became an RN, I was thinking, hey, once I go to the other side of the ER doors, I'm going to figure out how to better improve my care in the field so we have a better outcome. I'm sure if you're not familiar with the term already, you will become soon frequent flyers. There are a lot of patrons of the 911 system who use 911 as the easy button, essentially. They're poorly resourced. They don't know who else to call, will always show up. But when you bring a group of responders, whether it's law enforcement, fire, EMS, dispatch, or any of the subsidiaries, into a scene, we know that most responders join their profession to help people, and they hold themselves to a very high expectation. And repeatedly running on calls where you feel like you didn't really affect the outcome, you didn't change anything, can be incredibly demoralizing. And I think that really starts to contribute to some of that stress injury formation in responders. So once I got into the ER, surprise, surprise, I found the exact same thing I found outside the ER, because that's where we take our patients. And it's also a similar experience for them. They are the place where people who don't know where else to go. And I started to realize it was a far more pervasive problem, and we needed to take more aggressive action. And that's where my interest in mental health, in particular for emergency responders, and I use that term, we lobbied back and forth when we created Responder Strong ultimately. Did we want to talk about first responders? And we decided no, because most people envision police, fire, and EMS as the first responders. They miss the first responder, which is the dispatcher. And then they also miss all these other groups, the CSIs, the child welfare workers, the crime scene investigators, the coroner's personnel, all of these other groups who work in that emergency response umbrella and who are being impacted not only by these exposures that we are, arguably the single greatest exposure over the course of any of our careers is the intense trauma and suffering of other people, in the complete absence of any training on how to recognize that, how to manage it, how to come into a profession wanting to help other people and not recognizing that your sense of empathy and compassion can be a pathway for injury for you because you do empathize and you do care. And that we really wanted to reach out to everybody who works in that occupation. And also the other common thread, aside from the exposures, is that most of our occupations have had a eat our own culture, where any acknowledgement of mental or emotional impact from the job was deemed a sign of weakness. And Patrick can very eloquently speak to the fact that that is a significant barrier among the cultures across branches.
So for me, I think you asked initially, Haley, what kind of got me into law enforcement. And for me, it was kind of a natural progression. As I mentioned, I was in the military, and a lot of military, not all, but a lot of military, that's kind of a natural progression. And it was for me, because military is obviously the military. There's rank, there's structure, there's chain of command. And plus I came from a police family. I had a lot of uncles that were Chicago cops. But I yearned for that structure. I yearned for that, camaraderie that I got in the military for a couple of years I was in. So for me, it was a natural progression. So I got into law enforcement, started on patrol where everybody starts, and kind of worked my way up through the ranks. I was a detective for a while, a street supervisor. And again, retired as a commander, and it's different in different agencies, but essentially my job was I was in charge of all the patrol officers on the street. Not only that, but the supervisors. So again, the supervisors would report to me, i.e. the sergeants, the corporals. I would be their direct. So again, you might not think that being on being behind a desk is not stressful. It's very stressful when you're trying to manage different personalities, different stressors of the job with officers. So it's a very, very difficult job. And Rhonda hit on a bunch of key points that she talked about, like dealing with stress and how sometimes or often it's a sign of weakness among many people, with first responders and law enforcement. I'm from the LE side, but yeah, I mean, she hit it right on the head. When officers, I think it's getting a little better from my perspective, at least in my agency. I can't speak for all agencies, but we were starting to get better where if officers came with problems, came to me a lot of times, they'd utilize the chain of command, but they would talk to me, and it was not so looked down upon like it used to. But we still have a lot of work to do when it comes to dealing with those type of issues. That's where organizations like what Ron is doing in her work come in very helpful for the people who serve, brave men and women who are out there in the first responder field. So.
Well, and I think if I can tag on, Pat's doing a great job with this podcast and how pervasively it's heard. And I think a lot of this changing of our culture, it's coming from both ends. So it's coming from the more seasoned, experienced responders who are reflecting back, who are engaging others in this conversation that needs to be had, who are engaging leaders in this dialogue, really increasing the awareness and decreasing the stigma, normalizing our normal human reactions to what we're experiencing. But one of the other heartening things I see is that, to Pat's point, a lot of the veterans coming in have been pre-exposed to all of these concepts through their military service, because the military service is ahead of us on this curve, and we beg, borrow, and steal the programs they've developed to integrate into our population. But then also a lot of the millennial generation coming in. As much as millennials get maligned everywhere else, I find they're not falling into the culture trap like the rest of us did, and that they're really coming in. I can't count how many academies I've taught recently over the past, say, 5 years, where a recruit will raise their hand and ask, well, what about work-life balance? And that's not something we ever would have thought of in the past. So I'm really hopeful that this new mindset coming into our ranks will do a lot to shift our culture.
Thank you both so much. And that is a great segue into this kind of mental health topic that we are hitting here. So I want to ask you both about just the mental health and the trauma of the job. We know that first responders face a lot of challenges and trauma within their careers, often leading to outcomes like PTSD. Part of their personal lives involves learning how to manage these stressors. How did you personally combat job stress? What did you do to unwind off duty? And what resources did your employer have to facilitate the employee well-being and kind of the employee life balance that you touched on, Rhonda?
So back when I first started to notice the signs of stress in myself, where I was getting angry about things that shouldn't have bothered me, feeling more down than I had in the past, I would default back to just personal practices that have been lifelong ingrained. So that was spending time outdoors, being very physically active. I've always been a little nutso about what I eat. I've been into healthy eating. So those things helped, but they weren't enough. And some of the things that I started to realize were really important in the fire service in particular were crew-based. So I was usually in a station with 3 other crewmates who worked on the same rig as I did, or in a double company house where you might have 8 or 9 other people in the station with you. And some stations felt better than others, and it had to do with the social support. Was it positive or was it negative? And there's a saying in the fire service that crew is 90% of your satisfaction on the job. It's really who you're working with. So really paying a lot more attention to that. For our agency as a whole, back in the 2005 to 2010, we didn't offer really anything in the way of mental health supports except for EAP, which is a check the box program. And we all know, unfortunately, that conventional EAP programs are very poor at addressing responder mental health issues. And actually, I find for responders, we've really shifted. We don't use the term mental illness at all. We use the term stress injury, because in most responders, that's what it is. And it's a reaction to incompletely managed or coped with stress and trauma exposure of the job, sometimes administrative stressors and other stressors in life, where it just becomes overwhelming. But what what I'd found at the time was our department only had the EAP. The EAP was a joke. It wasn't respected at all. And in fact, it ironically turned a lot of people against reaching out for mental health help, because even if they overcame their internal stigma to reaching out and admitting that they were having a problem, they would get to a clinician oftentimes who may have been well-intentioned, but didn't understand the job, didn't understand the culture, to Pat's point, didn't understand the chain of command and why you might not go tell your sergeant or your lieutenant that you have anxiety and you were diagnosed. And then oftentimes they didn't understand the underlayment of trauma. So they'd be quick to jump on things like, oh, this is just alcoholism, or this is just anxiety, and not recognize there was trauma exposure underneath it. And if you can't treat the trauma, you can't treat the symptoms. The last thing we find oftentimes in EAP is that they also don't understand the coping mechanisms that we do use, dark humor being one of the big ones. And the sense of humor, the longer you're on, the worse it gets. And back to the point that we weren't taught how to deal with stress and trauma. We weren't taught ever in academy or on the job how to turn that switch and turn that bad sense of humor off, that jaded worldview off. And that can in turn create a lot of problems in the rest of our life. But so back on target there, EAP was all we had. It was very ineffective. When I became health and safety officer, which was towards the latter part of 2011, I already knew who the other ambassadors for mental health were on the department, those who were really passionate about this. We created a peer support team in the wake of the theater shooting. And it's something that I found not only within Aurora Fire and within Responder Strong and GMR and all the other organizations that I've worked with, is oftentimes the people who are drawn to peer support are those who've suffered and struggled themselves. And they want to prevent their coworkers from going through what they did. So they really want to be empowered to help others. And they oftentimes feel a calling that not only do I just want to serve the community now, but I want to serve those who serve the community. And it's really an additional calling. So we built a lot of our resources, and that's what expanded into Responder Strong, working across branch boundaries so that we could enhance each other and make constructive differences together.
Yeah, Rhonda made a good point. You know, when I first became a police officer over 2 decades ago, we obviously didn't have the resources. And I remember being in critical incidents where, you know, it was a simple matter. Hey, you okay? Yeah. Okay. Get back on the street. I mean, that's how it was. Thank God. I mean, we've progressed where we, like Rhonda indicated, we do have a lot of resources out there, you know, but, you know, like we talked about before, I mean, let's start with PTSD. I don't like calling it PTSD. I like calling it PTSY, and the Y or I being the illness part of it instead of disorder. Because I think when you have officers and first responders, when they hear the word disorder, they feel like, something's really wrong with me. So I think there's a stigma behind that word disorder. So I don't like using it a lot anymore. In fact, I don't use it at all anymore. I use illness. Think about it. If you're sick, broken arm or something, you can get better. You have an illness or something, you can get better. But when people hear the word, disorder, it's a lot harder for officers to come forward because there's still that stigma behind, oh, you're suffering, and officers, have a, tendency to get chastised and, being viewed as weak. When in reality, you are strong for coming forward. Look, the average person out there they see maybe a handful of traumatic events during their lifetime. The average officer over a span of 30-year career or so, I think that they've seen hundreds of traumatic events. That's not normal for humans to see that. And to Rhonda's point, I don't care if you're Superman or not, it's going to affect you. I was one of those guys. I was in an elite unit in the Army, jumping out of planes, doing crazy stuff. And I thought I was the toughest guy in the world. You know how you are when you're young. And then I got into police work. And I'm glad I did. But over time, the things I was seeing and the death and the trauma and the human suffering, it affected me. And it manifested. Like Rhonda said, she struggled with anger and other stuff. I was the same way until I had to reach out to help, and ask for help. And that's where I'm glad we still got a lot of work to do in the first responder field. Rhonda can attest to that with, taking better care of our brave men and women. But the first step is reaching out, and asking for help. But again, from a law enforcement perspective, there's still a lot of stigma in the Leo community. But it starts with the leadership in an agency, and they have to be on board with this, because the reality is, folks, people aren't flocking to law enforcement, and first responder jobs like they used to. So we need to take better care of the people we have, plain and simple.
Absolutely. And I love Patrick's point about PTSI, post-traumatic stress illness, post-traumatic stress injury. We definitely want to pull that away from the disorder, that you're permanent, you have mental illness, because responders, the only mental illness training we've gotten in the past is what we see in the community. And it's usually the extreme end of that spectrum, which just enhances that stigma. None of us want to feel like we're them instead of us. There's a lot of identity. There's a lot of solidarity with our coworkers, our crew, our teammates, and to be voted off the island, to be ostracized, that's a shame that's worse than death. And that drives a lot of people. One of the other big transitions we've seen, and I know Pat's talked about it a lot, is not even focusing on the injury or the illness with post-traumatic stress, but really focusing on post-traumatic growth and recognizing that none of us grow from a place of comfort or from complacency. And to use his analogy for physical injury or physical impacts, that we talk a lot about, hey, if you go to the gym and you just do bicep curls with 10-pound weights, you're never going to get those big guns you like to shove in a too small fire t-shirt, Mr. Fireman. And you've got to go with heavy weights. You have to do something that is uncomfortable and painful and push yourself. But when you come out, you are better for it. You don't look at a hard workout and think that you're injured or you're ill when you come out. You look at the long-term benefits that you get from it. And we're seeing a lot of these analogies really starting to reshape the way that responders are thinking about trauma exposures, about stresses in life, and ways that they can continue to live a good life. They can benefit from this rather than being broken by it.
And the one thing, Haley, really quick, I think you mentioned, or I don't know if it was Rhonda or Haley, about work-life balance. I come from a generation where, we live to work. And to your point, the millennials, the younger generation, I love them because they're coming in and they work to live. So I think you have to realize that it's not all about the job. You have a life outside of being a first responder. Rhonda and I both did our time. We're out of it, but we have lives outside of what we were doing. But so many people get wrapped up into the identity of I'm only a cop, I'm only a firefighter. And that's a big part of your life, but you do have a life after serving. So again, you have to realize that. And if you're suffering, in order to move forward, you need to reach out and ask for help.
And there's definitely been a lot of work and a lot of discussion around that particular piece, that identity, and how you transition your identity, whether that is from a promotion a demotion, from choosing to resign from the job, which unfortunately we're seeing a lot of in this year in particular, whether you are retiring or if you go out on disability. If responders haven't prepared, oftentimes that loss of identity is compounded by the loss of the shared community. People have shared experiences. It's compounded by the loss of the resources that the agency had, the structure, the schedule, the busyness, the things that allow them to keep all this crap that they've compartmentalized. And what we're seeing often in this year in particular is that we've got a lot of responders from across all branches who've just decided this is a world they don't understand anymore. They don't want this work. We know that the predisposing factors for severe COVID infection, heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, obesity, those run rampant in the emergency response fields for a variety of reasons that most often tie back to poorly managed stress or incompletely managed stress. So now they've got personal fear that if I'm more susceptible to this and I'm out on the front lines and I don't know who, if I make a stop on the highway, does the driver have COVID? If I'm running on somebody who had a heart attack, do they also have COVID? A lot of people have decided, well, I'm going to leave the profession, but they did it without having any preparation. Oftentimes they did it with no fanfare. When they leave, there's no retirement party because of social isolation and distancing. They don't get the gold watch, the chamois, the axe, whatever their branch typically gave. And then when they retire, they're not going into this dream world, this dream life that they idealized. They're going into social distancing to deal with the loss of identity and everything else that compounds it. And we're really concerned for that population because that's one of the things we've really been remiss in our occupations is teaching people, you are a whole person. You have to have hobbies that are outside of work. You have to have friends that are outside of work. You have to have interests that are outside of work. And that message, I think, is really doing a lot to help stave off the suicides and the issues that we see post-retirement in responders.
I know this wasn't part of the question, but are you guys seeing any evolution into having mental health professionals physically within departments or there on site from either the departments themselves or an outside source? Is that something that's happening, or are the officers or firefighters having to seek that out separate from their departments, if that makes sense?
Are you talking about mental health professionals responding to calls with first responders, or
responding to first responders' stresses? So are they at the departments? Do they ever check in at departments to see how PSI is going, how individual first responders are doing, or is that something that first responders have to more seek out?
Well, I think it depends on the agency. I mean, I think every organization is different. The fire service is different from law enforcement. Most big agencies, from what I know, I have a lot of friends that work like in DPD and Aurora and stuff like that. Like I know DPD has an on-site, I think, psychologist or in-house, counsel that they can talk to if they're having problems. But a lot of departments don't have that, Haley. I mean, and it comes down to funding and money, like most things do. But I think, like we talked about from the beginning, I think there's more resources out there for first responders. I would agree with what Rhonda said about, employee assistance. I think it's gotten a little better from my perspective, but there's so many resources out there. Responder Strong, just tons of resources out there that, yes, some of it is readily available to officers, but with a click of a button, they can reach out and they can have the resources they need. So I would, again, a lot of it's dependent on the agency, but most agencies don't have in-house mental health counselors, that are on staff. I mean, now, if we have a critical incident, like we had a critical incident, a lot of critical incidents, we'd have like Nicoletti and Associates come in and kind of debrief and kind of counsel officers if they needed that. So, I mean, the resources are there, but having somebody in-house readily available, we didn't have that, but we had it. If we needed to, we can get them there fairly quickly.
And absolutely agree with everything that Pat said. What we're seeing too is in-house, although it looks like it should be a convenience, oftentimes increases the stigma, because many agencies in the past, when they have had the in-house psychologist or counselor, they parked them right next to the chief's office. And who wants to walk down the main corridor in headquarters? Yep, I got problems, and dive into the counselor's office. So we're seeing Some of the bigger departments have it. They tend to be isolated off in a different location, the training division or a separate building. We are seeing a lot of agencies who will contract with a psychologist or a counselor that their people can access, and they do side contracts with them, so it can be no or lower cost for their employees. We've also seen a lot of movement across the country, and some of this spun out of Responder Strong, to better equip the clinicians who want to work with emergency responders. Two big programs that have come out of Denver. One is Sondermind, to Pat's point about getting EAPs up to speed. They are a startup who does bulk contracts with healthcare plans and EAPs. Then they get specialized lists of providers within it. So the relationship Responder Strong has with them, any responder in the state of Colorado and a couple other states now can call into a designated line or go to their website, say, hey, I'm a responder. I want to meet with a clinician who gets the job. And then if their EAP and their healthcare provider are both partners with Sondermind, they can establish a partnership right away with the clinician who gets it, use their EAP visits for free, transition care, so they've got that continuity of care with the same clinician to their healthcare plan, go as long as they need with their copays, and then after that have a flat fee out of pocket if they choose to. So that's been a really successful program in Colorado that decreases the fear of loss of confidentiality, increases the utilization of benefits, decreases out-of-pocket costs. But then the other big piece we were missing is when you look at certifications and credentials for clinicians who really get it, there's only been one in the country, and that's the American Board of Professional Psychology's Police and Public Safety Board certification, which is an incredibly difficult certification to get. It's only for licensed psychologists. And to date, there are only about 80 people in the country who have that certification. Most of them do fit for duties and pre-employment screenings, which completely eliminates everybody else's desire to work with them, because you don't ever want to be in that situation and have somebody roll out your file cabinet for what you came for counseling for. So one of the psychologists here locally who came out of Nicoletti's group, actually, Jamie Brower, just recently launched the National Emergency Responder Public Safety Center, which houses a national certification for master's level and for doctoral level clinicians who don't want to go for the Police and Public Safety Board certification. It's a standardized training, 56 hours, that will allow responders to look and say, yeah, this person gets it. They did rides. There's been attestations from agencies they work with that they're good and they get it. They have done 40 hours of didactic, and that's really starting to expand. And we're seeing some of the healthcare providers also reach out to that program to say, we want our clinicians to really get it, because they're going after the public safety contracts health-wise.
Great, thank you both so much for answering. We're gonna go ahead and transition a little bit. You know that we have to touch on COVID-19 because that's obviously what everybody is touching on right now. So we know that it has affected a lot of people, both professionally and personally, and many people's lives have changed completely due to this pandemic. When you two started your careers, did you have any training or any preparation for something to come of this magnitude? And have you heard of anything throughout the first responder field with how everything is changing due to COVID?
You want to go first? Or you want me to, Rhonda?
No, you go.
To answer, we never, in my 23 years in law enforcement, we're training, we do a lot of, training for emergency response and things like that, natural disasters, sometimes, spills and things like that. We do training when it comes to that, Haley, but I've never heard of any training specifically for something like a pandemic. We just never, it never came across our mind. We're definitely in new territory right here. I can tell you, the officers that I still know that are on the job, they are going through training and social distancing procedures and things like that. They do wear masks, but I've responded to a lot of emergencies, spills, train wrecks, things like that, some natural disasters, but I've never seen anything like COVID, where maybe Rhonda has. But but the key is we'll learn from this as a first responder community. We'll learn how to, and that's the great thing, the resiliency behind the first responder community is we're very resilient. We learn, most of us, and we learn how to do things better the next time in case we have to deal with a pandemic down in the future. But no doubt it has changed the way law enforcement has done things. I was saying before we started that, at least in my old agency, we're not responding to a lot of the calls we used to. due to COVID. I mean, we might stand by and stage and, see if we're needed, but we're not doing a lot of proactive stuff like we used to. Now it's more like reactive, again, from my perspective. But again, COVID has definitely changed the landscape of policing, and it probably continue to do so as long as it keeps going on.
Absolutely. And I think in fire and EMS, we had greater experience using personal protective equipment, but that was more geared towards things like bloodborne pathogens, the standard hazards. And, we did have occasional scares in the past, SARS, MERS, anthrax. And then to your point, Pat, about hazmat, we've all had the training for hazmat, but now every call is essentially being treated like a hazmat. So we're wearing a extreme amount of PPE for every call because you don't know. And what we're seeing with this is, particularly in the EMS community, they're being impacted. Some of the EMS in the US is fire-based, so that's what Aurora was. So I was a firefighter and a paramedic. In many agencies, the firefighters work for the fire department and the EMTs and the paramedics work for the ambulance company. And what the ambulance company was finding is oftentimes because they wanted to minimize exposure to potential COVID patients, fire wasn't coming in anymore. So EMS was on their own. Instead of having a backup of 3 or 4 people coming with them, it's just those 2, their partners, which enhances the challenge on some calls, the fear on some calls. The amount of PPE that has to be worn has really increased the amount of event fatigue when you have to put on your gloves and your mask and sometimes your gown and you have to maintain that distance, and you don't want to do certain treatments because you don't want to aerosolize the excretions from the patient or the secretions. It's a new challenge. It's a lot more to think about. The things that we used to just do by rote, put on your gloves and make sure the scene's safe, that doesn't cut it anymore. So we're seeing a lot more event fatigue out of that. And then after calls, crews are having to take time out of service to disinfect the back of the ambulance so that if the patient was positive, or if they learned that the patient was positive, they're not infecting somebody else. So there's definitely been a lot of fatigue around this. And the biggest, and I think the most challenging impact has been the fear. In our work, and particularly in law enforcement, there's always been fear for personal endangerment. And that just kind of got to be rote and standard. But now the fear is not only personal endangerment, but you contracting something, not realizing you're contagious and taking it home to your family, whether that's your parents, your spouse, your kids, somebody who's immunocompromised at home. And we have seen a lot of fear, particularly in EMS with, I don't want to wear my gear in the house. I don't want to wear my boots in the house. I want to take my clothes off before I leave work and bag them. And it's been this invisible enemy that just, if people aren't able to manage it well, can become something that's very demoralizing and almost leads to a victim mindset. So we're seeing a lot of psychological impacts and just that event fatigue. We're used to a crisis, respond, deal with it, and then recover. I mean, this has been crisis since early March. And that what we're seeing psychologically, the hallmark for 2020 is burnout. When we go back and compare it to 9/11, to SARS, to MERS, the hallmark psychological impacts were depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress injury, what you would expect. But now what we're finding is it's been such a long haul. It's been so involved. It's such a departure from the norm. We can't go to autopilot. And a lot of the COVID restrictions have oftentimes, and we're not aware of it, have robbed us of our self-care practices. So whether that's going to the gym, going to church, going to watch sporting events, going out with friends and family, celebrations, vacations, if you remember those. I mean, all these things that were really the ways that we recharged ourselves, those have been taken away. And we're finding that's contributing to the burnout, because the burnout is ultimately our lack of ability or our incomplete ability to take care of ourselves, to meet our basic human needs, and those are non-negotiable. So we're seeing the stressors over a whole career being compacted into less than a year now. And that's why it's even more imperative that we get the cultural changes Pat referenced, that we understand self-care is not a luxury, it's not frilly, it's essential. It is one of your most valuable skill sets on the job right now.
Thank you so much. And I think that, kind of opening up this conversation about COVID, we can see how the effects of COVID kind of cycle back to the conversation before that with the mental health and the long-term effects on independent first responders. So if there's nothing else from you two, we can go ahead and move on. Cool. So Can you recall any specific instances where a response was particularly challenging as a result of interacting with a member of the public? And what about a specific instance that was especially rewarding? I'm sure you both have lots that comes to mind.
Well, I'll go ahead and start. I mean, that's an interesting question because, I mean, there's literally, like you said, just tons of examples. But one that stood out to me was, again, responding to a particular call where neighbor dispute, neighbors are arguing and, we're not getting any headway to try to come to a resolution. We were there just to kind of mediate a dispute. There wasn't anything criminal, that was happening at the time. So, but again, anytime you're dealing, people don't call the police when things are great. They call the police when things, hits the fan. So that's the response. I mean, that's what we're responding to 99% of the time. So I recall this particular incident where neighbors were disputing. I can't remember what it was, but they were hot and heavy, yelling at each other. And it was just a matter of trying to one of them was more reasonable than the other. And it was just a matter of trying to just talk some sense and just try to remain calm, and try to get this neighbor to see the other side, neighbor's, other side and, his view. I know it's a simplistic, example, but, police are dealing with that as well as other first responders. Fire is always dealing with that, people that are unreasonable. But it's the simple matter of kind of using good communication skills, using that calm demeanor. And then you mentioned, being rewarded. I mean, look, I would rather talk my way out of anything than to use force. I could use force if I had to, but some of the most rewarding times for me, I know it's going to sound awkward, were when I would make an arrest and the arrestee would say, "You know what? Thank you, officer." It doesn't happen a lot, but there were times in my life where I really thought I was making an impact. Maybe I was changing the course of this particular person. And again, it might seem awkward to the viewer or the listener, but that was really rewarding because, first of all, it told me I did a good job. I wasn't being mean to the person. I wasn't being demeaning. I actually talked them into a set of handcuffs. So again, it might sound odd, but that was really rewarding for me. And of course, helping people, solve problems and, in distress. But those are some of the most rewarding times for me. And they don't happen all the time. In fact, they're rare occurrences when somebody's looking at you saying, "Thank you for arresting me." But it's very rewarding at least from my perspective, that maybe you're making an impact on somebody's life.
Oh, that's fantastic. And for challenging calls, kind of right there and along the same lines as Pat and I can't even pick out just a single one. There's been so many in fire and EMS where you're responding to a citizen who is impaired, whether it's from drugs, alcohol, extreme mental illness, and they're just irrational, they're angry, they're aggressive, and trying to stay calm and trying to work with this person with whom you can't reason. They've lost that capacity, and trying not to react. And that was one thing that I was always really impressed with the law enforcement who responded with us. Some of those calls, I would think, this is so off the rails. If I had a gun or a taser, this wouldn't end well. I'm really impressed with the way they're able to maintain their calmness and their demeanor on scene. So those are some of the most challenging calls when you just have to work the call through to an end, and this person is not going to cooperate with you, not out of fault, but because they lack the capacity, and how you manage that without hurting them, without harming them, and without being hurt by them. As for rewarding calls, delivering babies, always right up there. Core zeros, cardiac arrests, getting the resuscitations. And again, those don't happen very often, but when they do, it's really rewarding and fulfilling. And I think that speaks a little bit to Pat's point too, that we get into this job to help people. And in the situation he described, yeah, he made a tremendous impact on that person's life and maybe changed the course of their life. Resuscitating somebody, getting their heart beating again. It's a big change in their life. And I think those are the moments that we really live for. But as responders, we know as humans, we have negativity bias. As responders, that's honed to a very fine edge because to Pat's point, we don't get called to celebrate with people. We get called to the worst days of their lives. So you're trained to go in looking for everything that can go wrong and to prepare for it. That negativity bias is one of the things that we oftentimes don't switch off when we leave the job and go home. It can be the root of a lot of our problems. But it's also something that because that's so subconscious to us, we forget those good calls, and we forget that's why we do the job, and we forget the times we were appreciated, and we really focus on the times where we feel like we didn't live up to our own personal standard, or we got called out by an FI or an FTO or somebody in a supervisory role for something that we did wrong. And that can add to the whole spectrum of stress injury that we've talked about. So there's a lot of ways that we inadvertently over the course of our career start to focus more on the negatives than the positives, but that's a conscious shift that can have long positive repercussions for ourselves.
Rhonda, do you know off the top of your head how many babies you've delivered?
No idea. If I were to guess, maybe 50-ish. People in Aurora don't like to go to the hospital. They stay home way too long. And each one's different. Each one's a funny story usually. But
yeah. Thank you. All right, we're rolling into the last question here. We're a little bit early on time since it's only 3 of us and not 4 tonight. What would you like to see change in the criminal justice and public service fields moving forward, both for our first responders and citizens? And how do we improve and kind of mediate the interactions between first responders and the general public, especially during stressful times like we're going through right now?
You want me or you? That's a lot of questions. I think that's a question or great questions, Haley. I think, we definitely need some police reform as far as law enforcement goes. We need more training and de-escalation and things like that. So those are always challenges, with getting those reforms and getting training and things like that. But I would say, as far as training and what we need help with, from my perspective, being at the level I was at, we need to be more communicative. We need to communicate better because everything centers around communication. I don't care what job you're doing. We need to be better communicators. And, it's really interesting. And I was doing it for a long time, just as Rhonda was on her end. And we're really good with going and taking care of problems. We're really good at, talking through problems, but, we're not really good at handling our own problems internally, and things like that. So I would say, if we're better communicators, in law enforcement, we're going to be better communicators. We're going to be better at communicating with the public and working and collaborating with the public, because it's not a one-way street. It's just not all law enforcement. It's just not all fire. We need the support. We need to work well with the community. And as far as the community goes, I think, I think the community, I think they have a version, or they have an idea of what police from a law enforcement, from my perspective, law enforcement is very, very complex. It is a very complex business. It's much more than when you see on TV or the movies. A lot of people just get what they know of law enforcement off movies and television. I think there's a third of, all the shows out there are like law enforcement or cop shows. So I think the public needs to realize this, law enforcement's a complex job. They're bad cops out there. They're bad everything out there. But I think the overwhelming majority of officers are out there doing a very difficult job in a very difficult environment. But it's a collaborative effort to, everybody needs to be at that table contributing in order for law enforcement to get better, so we can better serve our communities.
Great. And yeah, absolutely. I think what we can do to improve our care for responders is a lot of what we've talked about: increasing awareness, normalizing the responses so it's okay to talk about them, which erodes the stigma, having open conversations. A lot of the content, a lot of the things we created coming out of Responder Strong are based on the power of personal testimonial. And if you check out our website, responderstrong.org, under resources, Lifelines is one of the mini documentary series we worked with Status Code 4 down in Colorado Springs on. And it's a series of 10 to 20 minute mini documentaries, all with personal testimonials from responders, most of whom are in uniform, talking about things like post-traumatic stress, suicidality, substance misuse, raising children when you're an emergency responder. And those have been very impactful. We have put those out free to anybody who wants to use it to spark conversation or to increase awareness. We know that one of the other big things we need are to have proactive tools, to Pat's point. We approach the mental health of responders in a triage-like fashion. We know there are a lot of people who are already in the red zone for a variety of reasons, and those are the ones that we need to hit first, with the ones we need to take care of to pull back from that edge. but the biggest bang from our buck comes from catching people when they're still in the green zone and teaching them how to self-regulate, how to self-correct when they recognize that they're developing stress injury, and recalibrate themselves, bring them back to a safe, good, healthy place. To that end, we've been really excited. The Anschutz Foundation funded a free Responder Strong well-being tool for emergency responders and their families across the country. It's also available to healthcare workers. It's on our website, responderstrong.org. If any of you'd like to check it out, please feel free. It's free, it's confidential. You set up your own account. It's a self-navigating system. And what it does is it breaks down self-care into different domains: succeed, thrive, and matter. The subgroups were created by focus groups of emergency responders. There are little quizzes you can take. You ever have that feeling like something's wrong, but I don't know what it is? The quizzes can help you figure out, this is the aspect of life. These are the basic human needs I'm not meeting right now, and help guide you to resources and content. We're adding in November geolocatable resources to that tool. Right now, it's just a lot of education and online tools and resources. We've got several thousand users. We've just started promoting it, but it's open to not only the 4 main branches, but to ski patrollers, to wildland firefighters, ER nurses, search and rescue team members. We've been getting a lot of positive feedback on that. So I'm hopeful that with tools like this, we can not only help with the awareness and the normalization, but one of my favorite responses when we first created our peer support team on Aurora was, I was talking to a buddy who was a firefighter, and finally he just rolled his eyes like, Kelly, stop counseling me and just give me the tools to fix this. Because ultimately that's what responders want. And many times responders are so high functioning, they don't necessarily need therapy. They need a coach. They need somebody to guide them to take better care of themselves. And that's what this tool is designed to do. We also have a Responder Relate chat app, which is an anonymous peer-to-peer, so coworker to coworker, chat tool for responders across the country. That goes a long way towards starting dialogue, normalizing experiences. So I see the field really starting to embrace these things. I love that organizations like ours are putting them out free of charge or at low cost so that responders can access them on their own. Agencies who don't have the budget for it or who are experiencing budget decreases, defunding, whatever, can reach out and use this as the structure for their own wellness program. And the other thing that I really like is that it's readily accessible and speaks to the volunteer experience. In fire and EMS, volunteers comprise about 70% of the US service. And a lot of these are people who have stressful day jobs, who are now going into this very stressful volunteer capacity in a community that they know everybody. So oftentimes when they run on these horrific calls, it's at least an acquaintance, if not a friend or a family member that they're encountering, yet they're expected to jump back in their vehicle and return back to normal life in 10 to 15 minutes without any diffusing, without any reintegration. And tools like this can really help them process on the fly so that they can transition back into life without carrying stress injury with them. And I think the improvement of resources, like we talked about with access to clinicians, getting qualified clinicians, getting other tools out there for responders to reach out to in their time of need, and really spreading that word that this is an injury. It's not a disorder. It's not something permanent. And so I see a lot of hope around that. I love that Patrick mentioned earlier veterans, and we do see that veterans are entrained into the emergency response professions at a far greater rate than they are in the rest of the workforce in the US. Last statistic I saw is vets comprise about 6% of the US workforce, but they're about 20 or 22% of the emergency responder community. If you followed any of the work with the Office of Suicide Prevention in Colorado, they did a great study from 2004 to 2014 looking at suicides in the state. And during that time, veterans comprised 20% of the overall suicides. During that same time, when they broke it down into emergency responders, veterans comprise 46% of the suicides. So we know that they are disproportionately represented. So I'm happy to see a lot of overlap between what the military is doing and what the emergency response branches, in particular law enforcement, are doing. So we really catch that particular sub-demographic. And to your point about how we improve our relations with the community, I really think it goes back to self-care. When we are better at taking care of ourselves, when we're not stress injured, we're not dealing with the anger, we're not dealing with the hyperreactivity, the neurologic changes that come with progressive stress injuries, we can be more kind, compassionate, caring in the moment, more professional, and more able to regulate our own emotions so that we don't become reactive to the unregulated emotions of others, and so that we can actually hear and foster that communication that Pat spoke about. Because when it comes down to it, a lot of the conflicts are really miscommunication or complete failure to communicate. And I think that self-care and learning and enhancing our relationship and communication skills is going to make us more effective with the community also.
Yeah, and that's a great point that Rhonda made. I mean, if we're not taking care of ourselves as first responders, and people are going to have bad days, I get that. But overall, if we're not taking care of ourselves, not just mentally, but our physical health, everything else is going to fail. It used to crack me up, these young officers that would come, and I'm not just picking on young officers, but, they would come in to the job. I was one of them. You're in shape, you're everything. And then over time, not all of them, or not, some of them, not all of them, but, over time, what happened, the stress and everything else just finally, started, creeping in my life. And I wasn't taking care of myself, which affected my service to the community. So that was a great point, that Rhonda made, that if we're taking care of ourselves as first responders, we're going to serve our community much, much better. And we need to do a better job at it.
And that's one of the aspects of our culture that I think has been most toxic, is that we have this martyrdom aspect, and we really, really glorify that. I can't count how many older firefighters, when I first came on the job, I would overhear saying, it'd just be better for my family if I died on the job. No, that's not better for anybody, especially not me. I don't want to be a partner and not have that happen. But we really have glorified that. Put others ahead of yourself. Take care of others. Don't take care of yourself. And it's been to our detriment. It goes back to the overused analogy of put your own oxygen mask on first. You can't be effective in this high-performing role if you aren't taking care of yourself. You are like a battery. You need to be recharged. And this whole martyrdom thing is just a farce.
Well, thank you both so much for putting all of your knowledge and all of your thoughts out there. I know that there are questions coming in from the audience. So if you'd like to submit a question, go ahead and go into the Q&A tab on the bottom, and we'll go ahead and get into them. Let's see. All right, we're going to start from the top. Did you see an increase in mental health administration after 9/11?
From a law enforcement perspective?
It's looking like it, yeah. Mental health for first responders, it's what it's looking like.
Yeah, I think I know a lot of NYPD cops. Obviously, I wasn't on scene, for that event, but I know a lot of officers that were first responding. They're the ones that were on the scene. Unfortunately, a lot of firefighters and law enforcement perished during 9/11, as well as thousands of other victims. But yes, there's no doubt that, a traumatic event like that, took a toll on, many, many first responders that were not only on the scene, but weren't even there. So yes, I think, traumatic events like that, have definitely, or you're going to see, problems within the first community, first responder community, shootings, Parkland, all these other incidents that we've seen over the years. Yeah, they're definitely going to, factor in with PTSI, like we've been talking about, and first responders suffering from a myriad of issues. But yeah, from a law enforcement perspective, yeah, I mean, we saw, a rise in that after 9/11.
Well, and I think 9/11 was the seminal event. That was the first big one in public view that made the crossover from disaster response, because disaster responders had mental health support in advance of the regular first responders. And this was the first time that I think the public and the response agencies recognized, hey, day-to-day 911 response is becoming on the scale of disaster response. And we do need these supports. This is going to impact people not only today, tomorrow, next week, but for the rest of their lives, for the rest of their careers. And if we don't address this challenge, this injury now, we're going to pay for it in the long run with people's lives, whether it's in quality or in longevity. And I think that really spurred a big focus across the country. FDNY, NYPD really took the lead on that, took the program seriously, and a lot of other agencies have since emulated what they did. And now, to your point, with Parkland and the other school shootings are becoming a more regular thing. There's been a lot of recognition that those are also potentially lifelong impacting critical events if we don't manage them appropriately. So I think that was really the big seminal event for the inclusion of mental health supports right after the cessation of operations.
Awesome. Thank you both. Let's see here. After 15 plus years on the job and exercising self-care, how and where is it even possible to have a healthy family life with a small leftover time?
You know, I came to a crossroads, Haley, in my life where everything was suffering in my life. I got divorced when I was about halfway through my career. Started dating again, got remarried, and I was heading down that path again for a short period of time. So to answer your question, you have to make time for your family. I came to the realization, like we talked about early on, that there is life after law enforcement. And long after you're gone, speaking from my experience and what I went through, my family's always going to be there. The job is important, but the job's the job, and it's not more important than family. It took me a long time to realize that, but you have to make time for, your spouse, your partner, your kids. I can't tell you how many baseball games or sporting events that I missed when I was a first responder. And I should have made time for that. I could have made time for that, but I was one of those cops that, I had to sign up for every overtime assignment. I had to, be involved in this and extra duty and all this other stuff at the detriment of relationships with my family. So for the officer out there or person out there who wants to know how to maintain the balance, family comes first. And, I'm glad that again, in my old agency, the younger officers coming in, like I said before, they work to live. They don't live to work like my generation. So they have a better sense of kind of work-life balance when it comes to that perspective. But you have to make time for your family. Look, officers, first responders have high suicide rates, high divorce rates, high alcoholism rates, whatever. But you have to make time for the people that really matter in your life. Not that your coworkers don't matter. I'm not trying to say that, but your job is your job, and your family. You have to make time for your family. You have to spend time with your family. And I know it's harder than, it's hard to do sometimes, but you have to do that to maintain those relationships with your family. And trust me, I know, I've been through that. But I came to the realization and said, look, I am not going to bring my job home with me all the time, which I've done for years. Now, it got harder the more I progressed up through the ranks, but I would tell my people, look, don't call me, unless the earth is coming to an end or something, then you call me. You figure it out. That's what I have you for. I'm spending time with my family. It's date night with my wife. I'm spending time with my kids. So you need to make time. You need to prioritize things in your life, and it has to be family first.
Love all of that. And I think one of the dangers in emergency response work, no matter what branch, is that first family, second family conflict. That, we have our significant others, our kids, our first family, but our work family can get to be our second family. And oftentimes when we're a sign of stress injury that we're unaware of is that we get a higher threshold for stimulation. So home life might seem boring or seem trivial. If you're already prone to irritation or anger, it might be something that just annoys you. And you prefer to be at work where it's real life and death things, where it's exciting. And one of the features that we see there is misattribution of arousal. So you're with these people and you're feeling excited, you're feeling energized, you're feeling jazzed, and you think it's attraction. You think that it's a tighter bonding, and it can be a trauma bonding, but you start to neglect your first family in favor of this family because they don't criticize you as much. Their expectations are lower. They share your sense of humor. They share your values. They share your sliding worldview. And all of these things are inadvertently they're not providing you positive support. They're reinforcing the stress injury. One of the big things we did is a partnership with Responder Strong is we created an 8-hour workshop called Responding to Your Relationships. It was in partnership with a Center for Relationship Education who builds curriculum around evidence-based relationship and communication skills, the things we think we're all good at, but most of us didn't have modeled well for us, and most of us aren't that good at. So we flavored it with the responder experience. That's been wildly popular across the state. It's been offered free of charge with grants. We not only invite the responders, but we invite their significant others. And it's been a great eye-opener for both parties to understand, oh, this is what's happening. It's not that you're becoming a jerk. It's not that you don't care about us anymore. This is physiologic response from your shift, or this is why you're so controlling, you think you're being protective. And it can start effective dialogue. I think one of the things that we really need to do is really incorporate the family more in our careers, not only at the personal level, bringing them by the station or having them come see the car or the truck, but also at an agency level, providing family support networks, family nights, really engaging the family and showing them that they're valued just as much as the responder. They wear an invisible uniform. And I think that's a way for the family to feel more valued. It's so easy for families to take a back seat and feel like their work isn't as important as what responders do. And if we're sending them that message, it's just going to reinforce it. I also think that some of the training that we do in academies around the mental health side of things is helpful in our family lives, directly and indirectly, when we're taught to flip that switch, take our psychological armor off when we go home. It's okay to be vulnerable here. A lot of family members I've heard say they feel excluded because their responder will come home obviously agitated. And when they're asked about it, they'll say, I'm fine. And they're displaying a different emotion than what they're voicing. And then when a coworker calls, they're just a million miles an hour on the phone talking about the calls. And the family feels like, hey, you just broke emotional intimacy with me. You care about that person more than you care about us. But really understanding, and I think a lot of the reasons the responders do that comes from a good place. I want to protect you. I don't want the crap I saw at work to come home. I don't want it in my sanctuary. I don't want it in your head. And we are taught at work, when we do an after action or we write a narrative report after a call, we go into every little gory detail, every little tiny thing that happened. But our family doesn't need that. They can just know, hey, I am exhausted. I was up all night. I saw some really bad stuff and I'm just really conflicted right now. We can talk about our emotions, which is something that we don't really talk about at work. So really teaching responders, hey, leave the armor, psychological and body, at the door and come home and just really be with your family and enjoy that time, like Pat spoke about, that this is your priority and your value, and devote your time and your awareness to them. It's easier said than done, for sure. But it's, I think, another area that we're becoming more cognizant of.
And the one thing really quick, just to mention, the one thing I tell people, especially young cadets and young officers, and this is not a dig on law enforcement, what I'm about to say, but you have to have friends outside of law enforcement. You have to. And again, that helped me with my work-life balance. Law enforcement is a very toxic environment. And that's just the nature of, not that everybody that works in it is toxic, but we go to a lot of, we've been talking about the whole time, it's going to affect you. And so what really helped me was, with my negativity and my anger, was getting friends outside of law enforcement. That really helped with my work-life balance, to realize that not everybody out there is a criminal. Like I was groomed to believe in the academy. Most people are good. We just see the bad, a very small percentage of a population. But that really helped me with my work-life balance. And that affected, that in a positive way, it affected my relationship with my family, my spouse. So again, you need to do things like Rhonda was mentioning, to help, to manage that, and realize that your time is going to end as far as your career goes. Your family's going to be there forever. And your family, yes, first family, second family, your friends are always going to be your friends, but you need to take care of your primary family first. And that is being there. And Rhonda made a good point about emotionally being there and physically being there. I'm not there if I'm on my phone all the time when my wife and I are at a date night, and I'm just answering texts and phone calls all the time. That's not being there. So again, it's a tough thing. Like Rhonda says, more easy said than done, but how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And you start with habits and routines, and eventually you can maintain that balance.
Well, thank you so much for your input to both of you. I don't know if either of you have read this book. It's called Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement by Kevin Gilmartin. Our president of Honor Society, she's awesome, Casey Evans, she's in the comments, sent me this book. And it goes a lot into this topic. So if any of our audience members are interested, definitely look up this book. It looks like it's on Amazon if you want it. Have either of you read it?
Mm-hmm. That's a Bible for pretty much all of the emergency response branches. Kevin Gilmartin's done a lot of really great work.
Yeah, absolutely. Kevin Gilmartin, we've had him on our agency. We did a multi-agency kind of thing where we brought Dr. Gilmartin in, and he actually presented to about 3 or 4 different agencies within Boulder County. So yeah, he's really a pioneer. He was one of the first ones really that kind of pioneered this work in officer mental health and first responder health and wellness. And we actually made it required reading with our officers, and we bought a bunch of his copies and actually said, you will read this to our officers. And he's a great guy. I've talked to him on numerous occasions. He's just an amazing guy and very humble, but he's been there, done that. He was a cop for many years. But yeah, he was a pioneer. He is a pioneer.
I love it. Sweet. So it looks like we have lots of questions coming in. We do have about 20 minutes left. We'll go right up till 7 o'clock. So we'll go ahead and get into another one. They're not coming in by time. They're just kind of random. So I'm just picking them by random. Let's see. There's a lot coming in. Okay. Does it take a public tragedy to produce change, i.e. 9/11 and COVID?
I think public tragedy, large-scale events bolster that change. I think the change is happening at a smaller, slower pace overall, but I do feel like the stimulus of those large-scale events that can't be denied reprioritize for agencies and catapult a lot of these efforts forward. I mentioned we had been trying to create some psych services and supports in Aurora Fire, had been trying to create a peer support team. Our chiefs understood the need, but they didn't prioritize it financially because we had other needs. Cancer is a big deal in the fire service. We needed second sets of bunkers. Fatigue was a big deal. We were understaffed. But the night of the theater shooting, I got a call saying, hey, can you roll out that program you've been talking about? So I think that's the value of those events in promoting mental health. It doesn't take those, but they can accelerate them.
Yeah, I would agree 100% with what Rhonda said. I mean, those events are unfortunately, and as devastating they are, they're catalysts for change. And those events, unfortunately, I think are going to keep coming. And like you said, those are the catalyst of change. And we learned that from 9/11. We did a lot of things different after that. We speaking of, like we talked about, school shootings and stuff. For instance, change, I remember Columbine, another unfortunate school shooting years ago, where we changed everything. Our tactics changed from a law enforcement perspective, where, if those of you who are listening to this or watching this are old enough to remember, SWAT teams were all kind of huddled up, and the news cameras were kind of saying, why weren't the officers going in right away? Well, they were trying to get on the same frequency and go over tactics and stuff like that. What has changed now from that, unfortunately, that unfortunate incident, is if Rhonda and I are first officers on scene and we have an active shooter, we're going in. We're not waiting for a SWAT team. So unfortunately, with that tragic incident, became a change with active shooter response. We're not going to sit around and wait for a SWAT team to get suited up and respond to the scene. So through tragedy comes change, unfortunately. So.
All right. It looks like we have a question specifically for Patrick. It says, Patrick, how did you break down the family first wall?
A lot of it is like what I talked about, and that's a great question. I came to the realization is I can't keep going down this path of putting my law enforcement family first and, signing up for all these different things. Everything was suffering. Like I said, I got divorced. I don't think anybody gets to gets married looking at divorce, but unfortunately I put my law enforcement family first for many years. And that had, a detrimental effect with relationships between my kids. So it really became, when I got married again, it really, came down to a fork in the road. Okay, do I want to keep doing this? Or do I want to reprioritize? Not that the job didn't matter, not that I didn't love my law enforcement brothers and sisters, but my family was first and foremost. And I had to reprioritize stuff. Fortunately, as I got promoted up, I was in a role where I wasn't on the street a lot. So I could make time to be home for dinner and make time to go to things and make date night with my wife. So I was in that role, thank God, that I had the ability to kind of, make a pretty good schedule for myself. But it's all about prioritizing, what's the priorities in life? And like I said before, many times, it's, when you're a young officer, everything revolves around your job for the most part. It did with me. And again, things suffered. My relationship suffered. My mental health suffered. But it's simple for me. It's just a matter of, coming up with, what's more important? What are your goals? who are you? Do you want to be a good husband? Do you want to be a good, role model for your kids? And I'm glad I took the route I did, because I have a great relationship with my wife, great relationship with my kids now. But I had to build that all back up for mistakes I've made. And I don't regret getting into law enforcement, but I regret not putting my family first the years I should have. So it's all about priorities, my book.
Thank you. All right, Rhonda, how has your gender affected your career trajectory as a first responder? Did it give you a different perspective as you took on your role in Responder Strong?
Oh, great question. Really insightful. So the U.S. Fire Service right now is about 4% female. When I was on, it was about 5% female. So definitely minority status. I very much felt, and it's very well known in the fire service, that women do have to work harder to prove themselves. It's just kind of the traditional way. I think that's changing now. But I remember one of my instructors telling me in academy, and he was male, that if a guy screws up on the fire ground, he made a mistake. If a female firefighter screws up on the fire ground, it's because women don't belong on the job. So it's definitely a big burden, and you feel like you're under a lot of scrutiny. So that, I think it definitely changed my experience. What I found is, for the most part, when I proved myself and I could pull my own weight, I was accepted just like anyone else. Conversely, when it came to taking over as a health and safety officer and really working on mental health, being female, I think, was a distinct advantage, that a lot of the machismo male firefighters felt okay talking to me. They didn't feel like I would judge them. They didn't feel like I was going to take their man card. They didn't have as much fear about talking to me, and they felt like maybe I would understand and they could have greater confidentiality, and they were less ashamed talking to me about things. So I think it influenced my career in a variety of different ways. And I definitely see, when I look at Responder Strong's followers, the women are the ones who like it more. So even though women are maybe 20% total of emergency responders, maybe 30, they're about 55% of our followers. I know guys look at it, but they don't publicly like it. So I think women are actually being a little bit of a catalyst in this change, and this call for, we have to take better care of ourselves overall.
All right. This is a great question, as I know a lot of us are spouses or family members of a first responder. How can a spouse better support the self-care, I assume, of a first responder when they feel it takes up so much time?
Wow. Can you ask that again, Haley? I'm sorry.
Yeah. How can a spouse better support the self-care when they feel it takes up so much time?
Well, I think it comes from it has to, like we've been talking about. From my perspective, the first responder needs to be transparent with the spouse, and, have, like Rhonda indicated, have the spouse more a part of what they're doing on the job. Then the spouse is going to be more in tune of what they're possibly dealing with. And that goes into that communication. So I think, for first responders out there, I was that first responder who would come home and you say, I don't want to talk about it. It was a crappy day. Isolate myself from my family. But the more I started opening up to my spouse and my kids and saying, all right, I saw this or I witnessed this and it's really bothering me, then it gave them more tools, and then it gave them more insight to what I was dealing with. Then they could help me more. And they could say, all right, we need to talk about this. We need to go talk to somebody. So I hope that makes sense, but I think it starts with the first responder. I think they have to be open, and they have to be transparent, and they have to talk about things with their spouse, because, without talking to my spouse, she could tell something's wrong, but unless I'm opening up, I don't think it's very effective, because she can't bring the tools, or she can't offer help that would be more effective than if I would have just opened up, if that makes sense.
Well, and I love that Pat brings that up, because one of the basic human needs that we talked about earlier, we all have them, and we all have to meet them, and we meet them through self-care. So the spouses also need self-care. So it doesn't have to be two isolated, not interconnecting forms of self-care, but the families need to feel like they're needed too. And oftentimes, in our desire to be that martyr, or to be self-contained and to take care of everything ourselves, because on the job, that's one of the big things. When somebody says, you okay? It's, yeah, I'm fine. I got it. I'll make it work. But that really robs the families of the chance to feel needed and valued by us. So having that vulnerability at home, even though it might take some time to get used to doing that, can just go a long way towards improving the home life relationship. And then as for other self-care practices, I mean, things like spending time in nature, you can do that as a family. Eating healthy meals, going for a walk, working out, all of these things can be done in conjunction with the family. So it's not that the responder comes home and has to be coddled and cared for by the family, that we have to walk on eggshells because dad or mom's in a bad mood or isn't talking. When we get that communication going and we get some of that vulnerability going, that allows the family to really interact in a healthier way with the responder and for all of them to help their needs be met. And like Pat, I was divorced while I was online also, and it was interesting. My husband was a fellow firefighter. He wound up marrying another female firefighter in the same agency, and we were at training one day and I said, hey, she's great and all, but I'm really curious because we are so different. What attracts you to her? And almost before I finished the sentence, he said, she needs me. Like, oh, and I realized, yeah, it hit me like a ton of bricks. And I was thinking I was doing in my home life the things that I was doing at work without thinking about it. I wasn't crying. I wasn't showing a lot of emotion. I was holding it together. I thought I'm being self-sufficient. I'm taking care of things. I'm not being a burden. But what I was really doing was isolating, and he didn't feel like he was needed at all. And that, even though I had the best of intentions, it drove a pretty significant wedge in the relationship.
Yeah, and I remember, to kind of piggyback on what Rhonda said, I remember with my first marriage, a lot of times coming home and being resentful to my wife because she wasn't helping me. And I remember one day she looked at me and she said, how am I supposed to help you if you won't open up to me and you won't tell me what's going on in your life? And that was really like a kick in the what. And that really, I mean, how are our spouses supposed to know unless you're opening up and you're letting them into your world? So it's a great question. But I think it's a two-way street. It can't just come from the spouse. It has to come from the first responder too.
Thank you both for being so open and candid with these questions. We'll touch on one or two more. Kimberly says, can you speak a little bit about the current climate between law enforcement and their communities? I'm sure this is adding to the mental health / trauma that first responders are experiencing during this pandemic.
From a law enforcement perspective, I mean, I think there's no doubt. Turn on the news, you'll see the tensions between law enforcement, and the community. I always tell people, though, and I'm a firm believer, that the majority of people out there support our first responders. It's a very difficult job, but the one thing that kind of is frustrating sometimes is to, see people kind of go along with the narrative that all cops are bad and stuff like that. I think, there's a lot of the majority of first responders are good people just doing a very difficult job. So, but I tell people all the time, especially on my show, I say, look, the overwhelming majority of people support you. I wish they were more vocal. But again, when people just buy into the narrative that whatever you're watching, that doesn't help community relationships. And I'll be the first to tell you that police officers make a lot of mistakes. We're not perfect. We're human. But, it's a two-way street. In order to solve the problems we have in our communities and to come up with some solutions, it's not one-sided. It's not all on law enforcement. Communities have to be involved, and they have to be at the table. They're stakeholders, and they have to be at the table with law enforcement. And I'm a firm believer we can come up with some solutions, but it's not a one-way. It's not one-sided. And so, a lot of tensions right now, but I do believe we'll get through it. But again, we need to come together and collaborate to come up with some solutions.
All right, we are going to answer one more here. Make sure that we get out on time. All right, let's do this one. So does your department support and encourage a peer support program, or did your department, or have you heard of a peer support program that has been particularly helpful?
Speaking from my experience on fire with Responder Strong and now with Global Medical Response, it's being pretty widely recognized across the country by all agencies that peer support is the foundation of an effective mental health program. Responders are more likely to listen to another responder, somebody who has that shared experience. And when a responder is feeling the shame that he or she is struggling with a mental challenge that might diminish them in the eyes of their peers, or when they're struggling with feeling like they failed to meet their own personal standards and objectives, that it really takes sometimes a peer, somebody who's been there, to sit down and talk to them, to show them that, no, this is a normal reaction. There is no shame in this. I'm here for you. And one of the other big valuable things we see, aside from the normalization and the support of a peer, is that peer supporters know how to navigate the resource system. Responders oftentimes don't reach out for help until they're in crisis, and then trying to navigate the resource system using Google to find something to help you isn't very effective. So having that trusted person who gets where you're at, who validates it, and then can take you by the figurative hand and walk you towards what you need is incredibly, incredibly beneficial. There are a lot of different models out there. They're all fairly similar. What they want to do is get to responders and normalize the stress reaction in the acute aftermath of an event, normalize it, and guide them to the appropriate resources. And also to teach them too that in the acute aftermath, these are normal symptoms. It's not until you're a couple weeks or a couple months out and you're starting to have the nightmares, or you're drinking too much, or you've got the angry outbursts, that's when it's become a problem, and that's when we really need to address it. So peer support, I can't say enough good things about. The hallmark tenet, and I know Pat can speak to this, of peer support is confidentiality. That's every responder's fear, is that their struggles are going to get out into the grapevine or get into administration's ears. So that's something that every peer support program that I've seen really reinforces, is what's said to a peer stays with the peer. It's confidential help all the time, with the only exception of danger to self or others, the duty to report. But otherwise, without peer support, it's really hard to have an effective behavioral health program or mental health program.
And absolutely, to Rhonda's point, I mean, they're the thing now. They're the mantra now. Every agency that I know, at least in my neck of the woods, has a peer support program in place. And like to Rhonda's point, first responders, especially cops, are going to be more apt to talk to another cop, a trained cop, than an outsider. So they're very, very important, like to Rhonda's point. And I'm glad that they weren't as popular throughout my career. We didn't have them, but I'm glad that they're there in place now for the next generation of law enforcement and first responders.
Well, Patrick and Rhonda, thank you so much for being here. I've had the privilege of moderating several panels, and this one just went above and beyond. It was awesome to talk with both of you, and on behalf of myself, as well as the School of Public Affairs, Criminal Justice Honor Society, thank you so much. I'm getting texts from people in the audience saying how fun and great this was, and we have lots of questions that went unanswered, so I know that everybody really enjoyed it. So thank you. And anybody watching in the audience, I'd really encourage you to go down to the chat feature down below. There are links to both Rhonda and Patrick's current projects, as well as a link to our next panel. So yeah, thank you both so much for being here. We really appreciate it, and it was a great conversation.
Thank you very much, Haley. Thank you, everybody, for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody, for showing up and listening to us. Hopefully it was informative. Rhonda, thank you for being here, my friend.
Always
Haley,
good to see you.
Thank you for the invite. It was enjoyable. Thank you.